The idea of humans transforming into wolves has captivated and terrified people for thousands of years. From the earliest myths etched into those clay tablets, to the frenzied witch trials of early modern Europe, and even the pop culture of today, werewolves have prowled the human imagination since the dawn of time. And so today, just like how a while back we did the vampire lore video, we're going to talk about werewolf lore, all the way from antiquity to modern times. But of course, the story of the werewolf is not just a simple horror movie narrative, but it's rather something woven from many threads, deep roots in religion and mythology, folklore and fear, psychology, and sometimes even reality. What exactly is a werewolf? Well, the answer to that question is going to depend on who you ask. The cultural perception. They've been seen as bloodthirsty monsters, cursed innocents, and even at times revered shamans. So keep an open mind, and we can talk about where all this started and how it all ended up. But first, let me welcome you to the channel. Anyone new, it's good to meet you, and I invite you to subscribe if you've not yet clicked that subscribe button. Now, this video, along with all the other videos in the channel, are 100% mid-roll free. You won't get any interruptions, which is good news. And this is because we are supported on this channel by Patreon, YouTube memberships, people who visit the merch store, and the occasional donation to the YouTube super thanks or the PayPal link. But aside from that, if you really want to help us out, you can just give it a like, subscribe, leave a comment, and hype the video for the algorithm, and tell your friends about us. Now, with all that being said, let's get on to the topic at hand, a history of werewolves. And I think you will find that, like with a lot of these mythic creatures, they have some pretty early origins. And you'll be surprised, because one strong candidate for the earliest werewolf story actually comes from the Epic of Gilgamesh. Now, if you're not familiar with that, it's basically a Mesopotamian poem dating to around 2100 BCE. So that's more than 4,000 years ago. In this ancient myth, the hero king Gilgamesh refuses the romantic advances of the goddess Ishtar. He recalls how Ishtar once cursed a former lover, a shepherd, by turning him into a wolf. The poor man, transformed into a predator, was chased and killed by his own dogs. Now, this tale of transformation by divine punishment is the first known instance of a human becoming a wolf in literature. And though it's a small mention, it's not an entire story based on the wolf man or werewolf. It certainly does set a precedent. In early myths, becoming a wolf is often portrayed as a either curse or perhaps divine retribution. In any case, the outcome was not good for this poor soul. But moving on from Mesopotamia to the classical world, we find Greek mythology and history rich with wolf-human transformations, and the most famous myth is that of King Lycaon of Arcadia. As told by the Roman poet Ovid in his Metamorphoses of 8 CE, Lycaon was a impious king who tried to test Zeus's omniscience by serving the god a meal of human flesh, not what he ordered. Well, Zeus, of course, was understandably horrified by this act of savagery, and as a punishment, guess what? He first struck Lycaon with lightning, and then transformed him into a wolf. In Ovid's poetic description, Lycaon's body is changed into that of a snarling wolf, yet he retains a trace of his old appearance. His fur still grey, his eyes still gleaming with fury. The myth is significant, not only because it explains the origin of werewolves, like the very term lycanthropy actually stems from Lycaon's name, and the Greek lykos meaning wolf. So there you go. But it also ties the concept to a moral transgression, and that is something that continues all the way into modern werewolf stories, of course. As for Lycaon, he became a wolf as a punishment for the most taboo crime, i.e. cannibalism. I don't know why he thought he'd get away with serving human flesh to Zeus himself, but I don't know. In any case, in the Greek imagination, becoming a wolf could be a fitting fate for those who behave like a beast, so I suppose it's kind of an irony in the punishment. Yet, Greek literature also provides a more matter-of-fact reporting of werewolves. The historian Herodotus, writing in the 5th century BCE, notes in History's Book 4 a curious claim he heard while traveling near Scythia, that is, Eastern Europe. According to local Scythians and Greeks, there was a tribe named Neuri, who magically turned into wolves for a few days every year and then returned to their human form. Herodotus relates this story with skepticism, but the very inclusion of it in his historical inquiry suggests that belief in shape-shifting tribes was taken seriously by some. And this account shows us that even outside myth, folkloric beliefs about werewolves existed and were recorded quite early on. Classical writers offered other rationalizations and anecdotes. Pliny the Elder, a Roman natural philosopher of the 1st century, writes in his Natural History that he found werewolf tales to be products of Greek credulity. Pliny recounts one Arcadian story in which a man selected by lot would swim across a certain lake, hang his clothes on an oak, and when he came back he would be emerged as a wolf. If for 9 years he abstained from eating human flesh, he could swim back and regain his human form, albeit still aging those 9 years. Such stories, Pliny suggests, were told as part of the cult of Zeus Lycaeus in Arcadia. Similarly, the Greek traveler Pausanias in the 2nd century mentions the legend of an Arcadian boxer, Demaianatus, who tasted the entrails of a human sacrifice to Zeus and was instantly transformed into a wolf for 10 years. And these accounts reveal a consistent theme in ancient Greco-Roman lore. Rituals or curses involving impiety in human flesh could trigger a wolf transformation, and it was often for a set period. One particularly vivid Roman story comes from the novelist Petronius, around 60 CE. In his satirical novel Satyricon, Petronius includes a story within the story, told by a character named Niceros at a dinner party. Niceros recounts how he once traveled with a soldier companion on a moonlit night, and when they stopped in a graveyard, the soldier suddenly removed all his clothes, urinated in a circle around them, and then transformed into a wolf right before Niceros's astonished eyes. The wolfman ran off, howling into the darkness. Niceros approached the pile of clothes, only to find that they had turned to stone. A detail implying some kind of otherworldly magic was certainly at play. And later, Niceros learns that at the same time a wolf had terrorized a nearby farm, but had been wounded by a pitchfork. The next day, he saw his soldier friend back in human form, nursing a similar wound. This Petronius anecdote, half comic, half horror, is one of the earliest literary werewolf tales, and it shows many elements familiar in the folklore. The need to remove clothing to become a wolf, the idea that a wound inflicted on the wolf might appear on the human, and the transformation happening at night under a bright moon. And it's from these ancient stories that we have the first few solid patterns emerge. First, divine or magical causation is usually behind the change. Gods, curses, or sorcery cause men to turn into wolves. And secondly, there's the moral dimensions that are emphasized. Becoming a wolf is often punishment for evil deeds or dealing with dark forces. Third, The duration of being a wolf can be temporary or conditional. It could be 9 days, it could be 10 years, etc. And that hints at redemption or return being possible. Notably absent in antiquity is the later notion that werewolfery or lycanthropy is transmitted by a bite, like an infection. That concept would come a lot later. Also, while these stories mention nighttime transformation, the specific link to a full moon is not strongly highlighted in classical texts, though Petronius's tale hints at a bright moon. The moon and werewolf connection would grow in later folklore, which we'll move on to talk about. But it's also important to mention that even in antiquity, some thinkers took a rational or medical view of lycanthropy. By the 2nd century, the Greek physician Marcellus of Side described lycanthropy as a clinical condition, a kind of melancholy where a person believes himself to be a wolf and acts accordingly. According to later summaries of Marcellus's writings, such afflicted individuals would roam graveyards at night and behave like wolves, especially in the springtime. And so here we see the beginnings of understanding werewolves not as literal shapeshifters, but rather as victims of a kind of mental disorder. And this is a perspective that would reappear much later in history. Even St. Augustine of Hippo, the early Christian theologian writing in the 5th century CE, discussed werewolf-like beliefs. In his work City of God, Augustine noted that, quote, "It is commonly believed that by certain witchcraft men are turned into wolves." Though he himself was skeptical of literal transformations, preferring to attribute such reports to hallucinations or demonic activity, a kind of illusion. Augustine's ambivalence does show a transitional view, however. The Christian worldview generally denied that sorcery could truly change a person's shape, seeing it as either impossible or a devilish trickery. Yet widespread popular belief in such phenomena had to be acknowledged. And thus, in the ancient world, we see that werewolf lore was already well and truly there, and quite multifaceted at that. There were mythological werewolves cursed by gods, folkloric werewolves as reported by travelers and storytellers, and even psychological werewolves in early medieval texts. And of course, these are the strands that would all feed into the medieval understanding of lycanthropy. And so, as we move into the medieval era, roughly the 5th to 15th centuries, we'll see that werewolf lore evolved under a new religious and cultural influence. Medieval Europe was deeply Christian. No arguing that. And the church's teachings shaped how people interpreted strange phenomena. It's all seen now through a lens of Christian ethos. The dominant belief among the educated clerics was that actual transformation of a human body into an animal was quite impossible. The world was ordered by God, and human remained human. However, this did not eliminate belief in werewolves. Instead, it somewhat just changed its interpretation. Church authorities often claimed that cases of shape-shifting were either illusions caused by the devil or just outright mental delusions. An early example is the 10th century church text known as the Canon Episcopi, which asserts that women who believe they rode with Diana or changed form, a reference to pagan night witches, were entirely deceived by Satan himself. The transformation was only in mind and not in body. This skeptical stance notwithstanding, people at the grassroots level had a little bit of a different report on things, and they continued to talk about encounters with wolf-like beings, and the idea of werewolves found its way into lore, literature, and local legends. Interestingly, the term werewolf itself, it's of course a werewolf in Old English, appears in an early medieval legal context, rather. The law codes of King Canute, who ruled England in the early 11th century, include a reference to a werewolf. In these laws, the word likely refers to outlaws or savage men living on the fringes of society. Now, to be cast out as a werewolf meant to be banished from the community, akin to being a wolf in the wilderness. This use suggests that the concept of a man-wolf was familiar enough to serve as a metaphor for a dangerous outlaw. The idea here is not necessarily a literal shapeshifter, but someone considered less human. It's a reminder, the boundary between metaphor and literal belief was often a little bit blurry in the medieval ethos. Medieval chroniclers and folklore also preserve folk stories of actual shape-shifting. One famous account comes from Gerald of Wales, that is, Giraldus Cambrensis, a 12th century cleric and writer. In his Topographia Hibernica in 1188, an account of Ireland, Gerald relates a remarkable story of the werewolf of Ossory. According to this tale, a priest travelling through the woods in Ossory, that is a region of Ireland, encountered a talking wolf. The wolf astonished the priest by revealing that he and his wife were actually human, natives of Ossory, who had been cursed by a saint to periodically take on a wolf form. Well, because of an ancient curse by Saint Natalis, every 7 years a man and a woman from Ossory would have to live as wolves, exiled to the woods, while retaining human minds. After 7 years, if they had survived, that is, they would regain their human shape and return home. And of course, another pair would have to take their place. The wolf beseeched the priest to give the last rites to his ailing wolf wife. To reassure the hesitant priest, the wolf peeled back the fur on his companion's face, revealing the face of an old woman underneath the wolf exterior. Satisfied these were truly human souls, the priest administered Christian sacraments. Gerald reports that the priest later recounted this incident to his superiors, and even the Pope was informed of this strange case of the pious werewolves. This Ossory werewolf story is intriguing for a few reasons, I think. Unlike the cruel, Lycaon or diabolical werewolves of later witch trials, these Irish werewolves were rather just victims of a curse, and they remained devout Christians even in wolf form. Gerald treats the story almost sympathetically and uses it to discuss theological questions. Well, questions like, for example, whether a transformed wolf/person can even receive communion in the first place. I mean, that's a debate to be had, I'm sure. But it does show that not all medieval werewolf lore cast the werewolf as evil. Sometimes it could just be a cursed human, deserving of pity, and even capable of virtue. The tale also contains elements common in medieval lore too, a saint's curse causing a transformation, which of course once again links werewolves to this Christian framework. A set time limit for the change too, 7 years. And the idea of alternating or swapping the curse among members of the community. Werewolves also padded their way into medieval literature and legend. In this period, they often appear in the context of chivalric romance and poetry, sometimes as enchanted nobles. A well-known example is the 12th century French lay Bisclavret, by Marie de France. Bisclavret tells of a baron who is secretly a werewolf. He must strip off his clothing to perform the transformation. When his treacherous wife learns of his secret, she steals his clothes, thus trapping him in werewolf form. The wolf Bisclavret maintains his human intelligence and gentle nature, however, and ultimately wins the favor of the king. In a rather dramatic scene, the wolf spares the wife's new husband, but viciously bites the wife's nose, later forcing her confession and recovering his human form when his clothes are returned. While Marie's tale portrays the werewolf as a noble soul, just in a beastly body, exploring the themes of loyalty and betrayal. Similarly, the romance of William of Palerne, that is written in the 13th century, it also features a werewolf who was actually a bewitched prince aiding the human protagonists. In these stories, the werewolf is not a monster to be killed, but rather a sympathetic figure or helper, just under an enchantment. Such medieval romances likely drew on earlier Breton or Celtic folklore, and they present quite a contrast to later views of werewolves as purely agents of the devil. Norse and Germanic traditions contributed their own flavor to werewolf lore during this era. The Norse had legends of warriors known as Ulfednar, wolf coats, who wore wolf pelts and were said to fight with the ferocity of wolves, akin to the better-known berserkers, who were also known as the bear-shirt warriors. In the Icelandic sagas, there are several instances of characters temporarily taking the form of wolves or bears. For example, in the Volsunga saga, a legendary saga with roots in older oral tradition, a father and son discover wolf skins that, when worn, transform them into wolves for a time. They run wild in the forests as wolves until the magical effect lapses. These Norse tales might not always distinguish between literal shape-shifting and shamanic or spiritual experience of becoming an animal in battle, but they show how closely the idea of human wolf transformation was linked to warlike strength and the wildness of other northern forests. But the line between a warrior who channels the spirit of a wolf and a literal werewolf might also be quite thin in these kind of narratives. In any case, over time, as Christianity spread through the north, even these traditions were reinterpreted. By the 13th century, an English chronicler like Gervase of Tilbury could casually note, quote, "In England, we have often seen men change into wolves during full moons," suggesting a mix of folklore and observation. Well, Gervase's comment in his encyclopedic work, Otia Imperialia, also explicitly links in the transformation to the phases of the moon, one of the earliest references to lunar influence in werewolf lore. So we see that even as scholars like Gervase wrote in learned Latin, they still acknowledge these common beliefs in werewolves as real phenomena, at least in a marvels and monsters kind of sense, I suppose. In any case, by the late medieval period, the lines between werewolves, witches, and demons began to become a little bit blurry in the popular imagination. Wolves were widely regarded as creatures of the wilderness, and often symbols of the devil in Christian allegory, the wolf threatening the flock of the faithful, etc. The concept of the werewolf started to intersect with ideas of witchcraft. It's not that older folklore vanished. It's not like that. But rural people likely still told stories of cursed werewolves or wolf-riding sorcerers, but the learned opinion began to fold werewolves into the developing theory of demonic witchcraft. You see, if a person truly changed shape, many theologians argued, it could only be through aid of the devil. Thus, by the 15th century, to accuse someone of being a werewolf was effectively to lump them into those accused of sorcery and devil worship. And you do not want to be lumped into that category. There are consequences. In any case, this transition set the stage for a very dark and violent chapter in this history. The early modern witch hunts, a time where werewolves became targets of persecution, just as witches did. And so we find ourselves in the early modern period, 15th to 17th centuries, that is, and we find an immense outbreak of witch hunting across Europe. Of course, intertwined with this phenomena was a spate of werewolf trials. Particularly in parts of France, Germany, and the Baltic regions, individuals were accused of transforming into wolves and committing horrendous crimes. These cases were often treated as a subset of witchcraft. The alleged werewolf was believed to have made a pact with the devil, who granted the power to shapeshift. and that was against the rules. Well, the trials provided a pretty grim window into how seriously the werewolf law was taken at the time, and of course how it could be weaponized by authorities to punish outsiders or even explain particularly heinous events. One of the earliest and perhaps most notorious incidents occurred in 1521 in France, in the Jura region in the town of, near the town of Poligny. Two men, Pierre Bourgeot and Michel Verdun, were arrested on the charges of being werewolves after a spate of child murders in the area. Under torture by the Inquisition, nonetheless, Bourgeot confessed to a fantastical story. Years earlier, lost in a storm, he had met a mysterious stranger who promised to protect his sheep. Desperate, Bourgeot agreed, and later attended a satanic gathering in the woods. It was there, it was said, that he renounced God and was anointed with a special salve that transformed him into a wolf. In wolf form, he and the others roamed swiftly through the forests. He admitted to killing and devouring several children, supposedly while he was in this wolf form. Verdun, implicated as the one who reinitiated Bourgeot into these practices, likewise confessed his involvement. Both men were found guilty, and both men were executed. This case, recorded by contemporaries, set a pattern, a deal with the devil, an ointment or belt enabling the transformation, and a gruesome crime committed in wolf form. It is chilling to note how the old folkloric elements, nocturnal gatherings, magical salves, etc., were interpreted through the lens of diabolism and used as actual evidence in court. Well, France, in fact, experienced a kind of werewolf panic in the late 16th century. Another case from 1573 involved Gilles Garnier, known as the Hermit of Dole. He was a recluse, living in the woods, who was accused of attacking and cannibalizing children. Garnier, likewise, under duress, claimed a demon had given him an ointment to change into a wolf, and he had indeed killed several victims. He was burned at the stake for this. Now, around the same era, in 1598, a tailor in Chalon was convicted of similar atrocities. He was accused of luring children to his shop, murdering them, and by some accounts turning into a wolf to prowl for victims. Unusually, the records of this case are quite fragmentary, but it became part of werewolf legend anyway. In the same year of 1598, it saw the trial of Jacques Rollet, a beggar in Angers, France, who was found in a wolfish state, literally with blood on his hands, and he claimed to be an actual werewolf. Roulet's confession was so evident, the product of mental illness, that after initially sentencing him to death, the court sent him to an asylum instead. Well, perhaps the most infamous werewolf trial was that of Peter Stump in 1589 in Bedburg, Germany. Stump, also recorded as Peter Stubb or Stube, was a farmer in the Rhineland, who after being caught and tortured, confessed to an extraordinary list of crimes. He claimed that the devil had given him a magical wolfskin belt that allowed him to turn into the likeness of a greedy, devouring wolf, strong and mighty, whenever he wore it. In this form, over the course of 25 years, Stump said he had ravaged the countryside, killing 13 children and 2 pregnant women among other victims and eating their flesh. He even confessed to killing and eating his own son, and to an incestuous relationship with his daughter, as well as consorting with a succubus she-demon. The authorities were understandably horrified, and they executed Stump in a manner as ghastly as his alleged crimes. He was tortured on the wheel, his limbs were broken, and was finally beheaded and burned, along with his daughter and mistress who were accused of aiding him. Now, the case of Peter Stump was widely publicized, A lurid pamphlet was printed in multiple languages, including a 1590 English edition titled The Damnable Life and Death of Stube Peter, ensuring his story became well known far and wide. And Stump's trial certainly marks a peak in werewolf persecution. It demonstrates how the werewolf legend by then had absorbed all the elements of a diabolical conspiracy. A pact with Satan, an object for transformation, serial murder, and of course cannibalism. But not all accused werewolves were adults. In 1603, in southwestern France, a teenage boy named Jean Grenier claimed that he and others his age were given wolf skins and an ointment by a demon lord, and they would gather together as wolves. Grenier boasted of killing and eating several children. Unlike many other trials, Grenier's case was handled by a more skeptical judge, who determined that Jean was mentally disturbed, perhaps suffering from what we'd now call clinical lycanthropy or simply pathological behavior. Rather than executing the boy, the court sentenced him to confinement in a monastery. Years later, a visiting official recorded that Grenier was still alive, living in a remote abbey. He ate raw meat. He had claw-like fingernails and sunken eyes, and still howled, claiming to be a wolf. Well, this somewhat compassionate outcome was pretty rare, I'm sure you can understand, but it does show a shift. By the 17th century, at least some authorities started interpreting these werewolves as madmen rather than true shape-shifting fiends. The werewolf trials, of course, were not confined to France and Germany. In the Nordic countries and Eastern Europe, there were beliefs rather the same. In Estonia and Latvia, Livonia at the time, for instance, people were accused of witchcraft and sometimes described themselves as part of a band of wolf-men. A remarkable case in 1692 tells of an elderly Livonian man, remember Latvia, named Thies of Kaltenbrunn. Now, Thies frequently admitted in court that he was a werewolf, but his story took an unexpected turn. He insisted that he and the other werewolves were the hounds of God. They transformed, not to harm the innocent, but to fight the devil. Well, according to him, the Livonian werewolves would turn into wolves and descend into hell to battle witches and demons, and this would ensure good harvests. He claimed that werewolves were the agents of God's justice against evil. The judges, quite perplexed and not sure how to handle such a heretical yet non-malignant confession, eventually sentenced these to flogging and banishment for superstition. Now this tale's fascinating because it preserves a vestige of an older folk belief where being a werewolf wasn't automatically such a bad thing. You see, in his mind it was even a holy mission, and does remind us that the church's view and peasant folklore would certainly diverge widely. For the peasantry, werewolves might still be part of the shamanistic or protective tradition, even as the elite culture demonized them. And of course, you only really get the records written from those who can afford parchment and ink. In any case, by the late 17th and early 18th century, the European witch hunts and with them werewolf trials were beginning to wind down. The Age of Enlightenment brought increasing skepticism towards such supernatural accusations. Intellectuals argued that tales of werewolves were the result of ignorance, mental illness, or, in some points, just an outright hoax. For example, people recognized the role of hallucinogenic herbs or witches' ointments containing belladonna, ergot, etc., that might make someone believe they had changed form. Medical explanations like rabies were also proposed to explain the historical werewolf rage. After all, rabid wolf bites could turn a person violent and mad. A rational kernel behind the idea of infection by bite, of course. Some suggested that real wolves attacking villages, which was a genuine danger in pre-modern Europe, were later romanticized or misremembered as werewolf attacks, or even used by criminals as a cover for murder. And of course, then there's the Beast of Gévaudan incident in France, 1764 to 67, as a case where a series of real wolves or wolf-like creature attacks led to over 100 deaths, while occurring just after the witch hunt era. It revived public fears of a monster wolf and later became mythologized as a possible werewolf or supernatural beast in popular retellings. However, by the 18th century, the authorities tasked with hunting the Beast of Gévaudan used guns and tracking hounds, not witch trials, reflecting to a shift to a more empirical mindset. Of course, we could make a whole video about the Beast of Gévaudan, but eventually they thought they found him. They got a very skilled hunter who eventually did shoot the rather large wolf believed to be the Beast of Gévaudan, skinning it and bringing it to the authorities to be sort of displayed in pride. The problem was the wolf attacks kept going. But, well, people just stopped caring after a while. In any case, the werewolf lore during the witch hunt era had a dark and tragic aspect, of course. It was not merely a story told by the fire like we have these days, but something that could really get you into a lot of trouble and could get a lot of people brutally killed. It's a pretty complex story of genuine belief, fear of the devil, social scapegoating, and the horrors of serial violence, some of which might have been very real acts by very deranged individuals, and they all coalesced in these trials. The era left a legacy of the werewolf as the ultimate predator-human hybrid, linked with cannibalism and savagery in the European mind. But it's not just all about Europe, isn't it? Of course, well, depending on where you're listening from, at least in my culture, we identify more with the European side of things. But other parts of the world had their own traditions, and we should go through them. They often even feature differing animals, too. But the idea of humans transforming into animals is a near universal folklore motif. The global survey of were creatures can show us parallels and contrasts. Well, let's look at Africa first. In fact, there are many African cultures that feared people could turn into fearsome predators. Though, since true wolves are scarce in Africa, the role fell to other beasts. For example, in Ethiopia and surrounding regions, we find the legend of the Boda, or the were hyena. The Boda are often portrayed as malevolent sorcerers, frequently blacksmiths by trade, who at night can become hyenas, prowling graveyards and digging up corpses, not to mention attacking livestock. These hyena men are greatly feared and thought to have magic powers. Likewise, in West Africa, the Ashanti and others tell of were leopards, humans who can transform into leopards, that is. And in some North African and Middle Eastern tales, there are were jackals. These beings, often associated with secret societies and witchcraft, are believed to use their abilities for nefarious purposes, such as attacking enemies or committing crimes under cover of darkness. In fact, in the 19th and 20th centuries, colonial authorities in Africa even encountered criminal groups like a leopard society that killed victims, lending some reality to the legend of the were-leopards. Just not exactly what they were thinking. In South and East Asia, tigers and foxes are prevalent in shape-shifting culture. In India and Bangladesh, folklore speaks of were-tigers, humans, sometimes sorcerers, sometimes people under a curse, who could become tigers and prey on livestock or enemies. Some Southeast Asian cultures have similar tiger shaman traditions, where a person's soul might magically travel in tiger form. Meanwhile, China and Japan have abundant fox spirit lore. Korea, too, rather than wolfmen. Chinese tales of the Hu Li Jing, the fox spirit, and Japanese stories of the kitsune, often involve foxes taking on human form, and is typically to seduce or trick humans. They're almost the inverse of the werewolf, animals becoming human. Yet the concept of a shapeshifter is central. However, wolves do appear in other Asian lore. For example, some Turkic or Mongolic peoples revered a mythical wolf ancestor. The legend of Asena, a she-wolf, explains the origin of the Ashina clan. And stories of people transforming into wolves or being raised by wolves exist in those cultures as part of the heroic legends, not really as part of witchcraft, though. Native American traditions also contain shapeshifter beliefs, often within the context of shamanism or witchcraft. Among the Navajo of the southwestern U.S., the infamous skin walker, which sounds terrifying, is a type of witch who can transform into an animal such as a wolf, coyote, or owl by wearing its skin. Now, skinwalkers are very feared entities, believed to use their powers to wreak harm, that spread illness, cause death, etc. And the belief in them persists strongly in these Native American communities even today. As for Mexico and Central America, the concept of a nagual is a sorcerer who can assume animal form. Commonly a dog, perhaps a jaguar rather, an owl. In some stories it's a wolf or a coyote. They do this to perform either protective magic or perhaps evil deeds. The Aztecs, for instance, they had elite warriors called the jaguar warriors, and also spoke of the other beings called the Lahuelpuche. Hope I'm saying that right. Sorry for not having perfect Aztec pronunciation. Either way, they were beings somewhat, I guess they were akin to vampires, but often conflated with animal transformation. Now further north in Canada and the Great Lakes region, we encounter the legend of the Wendigo among the Algonquian peoples. The Wendigo is not exactly a werewolf, but rather a malevolent spirit or cursed person that engages in cannibalism and takes on a gaunt, monstrous form, sometimes described with deer or wolf-like features. This legend, emphasizing cannibalism and spiritual corruption, resonates with the theme of humans turning into predatory monsters, much like the European werewolf tales of hunger for human flesh. It's not exactly the same, but it rhymes somewhat. Now, in regions like the Pacific Islands and Australia, there were fewer large predators, but shape-shifting narratives still existed. For example, the Maori mythology in New Zealand, certain legendary beings or demigods could change form, though typically into birds or sea creatures rather than wolves. In some Polynesian folklore, sorcerers could become sharks or other animals, while werewolves, in the strict sense, are quite absent. There are no native canids in many of these islands, but the notion of transforming into an animal was still part of the broader shamanic and mythic worldview. In any case, across all these cultures, the consistent thread is the crossing of human-animal boundaries for various regions. It could be to gain power, to fulfill a curse, or to practice malevolence. The specific animal varies according to which creature looms largest in the collective psyche. The European werewolf is just one prominent instance of a global human fascination with shape-shifting. Notably, outside Europe, these beliefs often remained part of myth and localized witchcraft fears, without escalating into the kind of mass trials seen in the European witch craze. Though, as mentioned, localized violence against suspected shapeshifters could occur. When Europeans later encountered these analogous legends during colonial times, they sometimes reinterpreted them through their own lens of werewolf lore, adding yet another layer to the intercultural history of shapeshifters. And so, by the 18th and 19th centuries, with the Enlightenment in ascendance, werewolves had largely retreated from courtrooms and into the pages of folklore collections and literature. Scholars and clergy in the 1700s took an interest in cataloguing superstitions, and werewolf legends were recorded as quaint beliefs of the peasantry. All of a sudden it was becoming a bit of fun to talk about these things. Not so scary anymore. For example, the 17th century intellectual Johann Weyer had earlier suggested that those who thought they were werewolves were suffering more from a kind of melancholic delusion. Later, French writers like Henri Boucher and others documented cases of lycanthropy, with a mix of skepticism and curiosity. The word lycanthropy itself was adopted by psychiatry to describe a delusion of being a wolf. And indeed, cases of clinical lycanthropy have been documented in medical literature even into modern times, individuals truly believing that they are or have transformed into a wolf, often associated with severe mental illness. Well, this medicalization was one modern approach to the werewolf idea, but in parallel, Romantic and Gothic literature of the 19th century embraced the werewolf as a subject of fascination and horror, and that's mainly where we get our perceptions of it. While Gothic writers initially gravitated more to vampires, ghosts, and other supernatural figures, werewolves soon joined the roster of literary monsters. One early literary werewolf appearance can be found in Samuel Taylor Coleridge's unfinished poem, Christabel, written in 1797, which hints at a mysterious woman who might be a shapeshifter, described with a bit of wolfish imagery. By the mid to late 1800s, explicit werewolf characters emerged in fiction. French authors such as Prosper Mérimée in Locus of 1869 and Alexandre Dumas in The Wolf Leader 1857 themselves wrote werewolf tales. And perhaps the most famous 19th century werewolf short story was The Werewolf 1896 by Clemens Hausmann, which presented a haunting narrative of a female werewolf. These works often portrayed the werewolf as a tragic or cursed figure, rather than one that was willingly evil, and reflects the Romantic era's tendency to sympathize with the tormented outsider, and also that theme of exploring the duality of human nature. The line between folklore and fiction was quite thin. Even as writers invented new werewolf stories, they drew on the rich traditional motifs collected by ethnographers and antiquarians. Victorian folklore enthusiasts like Sabine Baring-Gould compiled historical accounts and peasant tales of werewolves, publishing The Book of Werewolves in 1865, which regaled readers with everything from ancient myths to the trial of Peter Stump. Such works reinforced archaic lore to modern audiences and provided a rich source of material for creative writers. And in the 20th century, well, things were truly propelled, and the werewolf found itself in popular culture worldwide. The invention of cinema was key. Universal Studios' The Wolf Man in 1941, starring Lon Chaney Jr., cemented the image of the werewolf as a tragic figure, cursed to turn into a wolf under the full moon, and doomed unless killed by a silver bullet. This film and others in the 1930s and 40s, like The Werewolf of London in 1935, established much of what people consider traditional werewolf lore, even when those elements were modern innovations. Well, for instance, the idea that a werewolf's transformations are tied specifically to the full moon became quite ubiquitous through the old movies, as did the notion that a bite from a werewolf is how the curse is spread. In older folklore, a werewolf might become so through sorcery or birth, perhaps divine punishment. But Hollywood changed that. They made it more like this contagious disease motif. Similarly, the silver bullet weakness. While not entirely invented, you see, silver was historically viewed as a pure metal, so in few folklore instances it was used against witches or monsters. But in any case, it was popularized by 20th century fiction as a definitive werewolf killer, much like the stake through the heart for the vampire. Through the latter 20th century, werewolves became a staple of horror and fantasy media. They starred in countless films, the classic An American Werewolf in London, 1981, to action-oriented franchises like Underworld, and they have appeared in humor and children's works as well. The hapless protagonist in Teen Wolf, 1985, or various cartoon werewolves. And by the turn of the 21st century, the werewolf had even become something of a romantic anti-hero, a kind of paranormal romantic figure. And in those urban fantasy genres, think of stuff like Twilight and all that, how it's portrayed. I wasn't really a fan, but whatever. Anyway, in these modern portrayals, we see the werewolf used as a versatile metaphor. It can represent the unleashing of primal anger, or even sexuality, the conflict between one's civilized self and the wild instincts, or the pain of being an outsider who's feared by society. The werewolf's capacity to evoke both fear and pity has made it an enduring figure, capable of endless reinvention in stories. And of course, then there's music. The great band, Powerwolf. Now, it seems like they keep doing the same album over and over again, but it's a good album. They've been going for quite a while now. If you're not familiar with Powerwolf, they're basically a metal band, kind of like a melodic symphonic metal band that's based around the werewolf motif. And they're quite good. They put on a hell of a show. They're from Germany, I think. Yeah, they are from Germany, yes. In any case, go and listen to them if you're interested. What should I... Maybe the song Amen and Attack is a good one. And... I don't know. Listen to the older albums first. They're good. They're my favorites. In any case, modern science and folklore studies have also revisited the werewolf concept from analytical angles. Now, some historians have tried to find a more rational explanation for it. These historical werewolf cases, as mentioned earlier, attributing them to things like ergot poisoning, a fungus that can cause hallucinations and strange behavior, which might have induced wolfish delusions in the medieval peasants. Perhaps even to misidentified animal attacks, like we said, scapegoating. And of course then there's rabies as a possible influence. A person bitten by a rabid wolf would themselves become aggressive and likely bite others, almost like a twisted mirror of the bite turns you into a werewolf trope. Another angle is cultural. The werewolf legend has been examined as an expression of deep-seated fears of the wild and the animal within, especially in societies like medieval Europe where wolves were top predators and a real danger in dark forests beyond the village. But it's also worth mentioning the case of hypertrichosis, a rare genetic condition that causes excessive hair growth over the body. In earlier centuries, individuals with hypertrichosis were sometimes exhibited in circuses or courts as wild men or wolf people. A famous example is Petrus Gonsalvus, a 16th century man from the Canary Islands who had the affliction and became a curiosity in the French royal court. His marriage and children, some of whom inherited the condition too, are thought by some to have inspired the fairy tale Beauty and the Beast. While hypertrichosis has no actual relation to werewolves, the visual similarity likely kept the idea of human-animal hybrids in the popular imagination, and the term werewolf syndrome has even been colloquially used for hypertrichosis. So cases like this show how real medical conditions and the mythic archetypes can somewhat intersect in the public mind. Curiously, even in the late 20th and 21st centuries, there have been occasional claims of hoaxes keeping the werewolf idea alive in reality. For instance, the folklore of rural communities in Europe still had whispers of werewolves or wolf-like creatures into the 1900s. And in popular media, reports of supposed modern werewolves surface from time to time, often better explained as feral individuals or local legends flaring up. In any case, today, the werewolf lives mostly in our entertainment, our imaginations and literature, but also in a psychological metaphor. Some people speak of having a werewolf side as a figure of speech. And even in subcultures, there are some people today who identify as part of a Therian community, feeling a kind of spiritual kinship with wolves, well, a far more benign echo of the older shapeshifter idea, and not really something I want to go into too much. So this is where we end the video for today. And I really hope you enjoyed it. People talk about vampires quite a lot, that sort of thing, but not too often werewolves, but they're quite fascinating, I think. In any case, I'm going to thank the top-tier patrons and supporters: Kimberly, Christine, Sally, Ember, Susan, Cameron, Kerry, Charlene, Lynn, Therese, Katiana, Nicholas, Ulford, Nia, which, funny, we heard that name as we were going through today, didn't we? Alexander, Charles, Christine, Dr. Neuro Nerd, Erin, Jaden, Jim, Jeffrey, Jessica, Madeline, Melissa, Orthodox Review, Scott, Shell, Wendy. Who else have we got? Josie, Sarah, Ryan, Thor, Cameron, Stefan, Kevin, HMSHH, Crystal, Calvary, Anthony, Lucy, Brandon, Gugu Bubonic, Nicholas, Craig, Neftus, Alexander, Gokan, Dorsey, Venita, Claire, Cordsey, Carol, Robert, Mary, Bridget, Nefertari, Yvette, Miss Mochi, 11, Allison, Free American, Jennifer, Brittany, David, Cody, Brian, Are You My Mum, Rhonda, Carrie, Catty B, Lovely, Poma, Kevin, Marissa, Alta, Zakin, Lucy, Julianne, and Rosie. Thank you so much. I hope you enjoyed it, and I will see you in the next exciting video. Good night, everyone. Lots of love to you all, and watch out for werewolves. Oh, farewell for now.